Welcome back, everybody. We are on part 3 of the How to Architect a Bookmark feature series here that we're putting together. Just so we give a quick recap of where we left off, we have a database model. We went through kind of 3 potential options here for architecting our bookmarks feature, and we have settled on the idea of using a join table to bring together the article and the user for bookmarks. This had a number of advantages, one of which was being able to paginate more easily. It was also allowed us to update the article independently without having to comb through the users, right? So we had like our option 1 and 2 where we were thinking of storing bookmarked articles underneath the user in some way, which would have allowed like fast fetching for bringing the bookmarks to an all bookmarks page, but it would have created complications for us when it came to actually updating any kind of article data, or if it came to paginating kind of the user data there, it would have been a little more complicated. And then I wanted to throw another kind of wrench in the chain, because this tends to happen a lot, and I'm going to, kind of showcase how requirements change no matter what your best efforts are. The client came back to us. We were throwing in some questions here. They didn't answer any of the questions we actually had, but they showed up and said, hey, by the way, I forgot that we need to show how many times this article was bookmarked. And, some kind of a business person was like, oh yeah, sounds super simple. All the stakeholders decided it was simple, and they threw you the screen. And here we are. Now, had we picked option 1 and started coding, and this happened, we would have been in a little bit of a difficult spot, right? We would have had all these articles stored under the user, even if we went with the version, which was option 2, where the article was separate, but we had a reference to the article under the user. Figuring out how many times this was bookmarked would have required a bunch of re-architecting, right? We either would have had to loop over every user and count all the bookmarks across all the users, which would basically have been untenable at scale, or we would have had to store some kind of account somewhere, which could become out of date, right? Keeping that in sync every time. What if somebody bookmarks something but the counter fails and the data could be inaccurate? We could use some kind of event system, and there could potentially be gaps in that. But because we went with option 3, we can actually always look up all the bookmarks by article ID and figure out how many times this has been bookmarked. So it allows us to really, really easily, we already have, fetch bookmarks by article ID. And that response from our database is going to give us a length, so we know how much to paginate by default. So we already know we can handle that. And then we can go here, also need to be able to get a total count of all bookmarks for an article. This will be in the database response. So super simple there. Our architecture held up to our first real change that kind of got thrown in at the last minute. Now I want to start to think about what are the actual interfaces for these different pieces. So let's kind of start taking a look, and we're just going to pull out some text, and I'm going to change the font to like this code font so that it makes a little more sense. Let's just say we have our article here, and let's kind of I'll do a little type, article, just so we can kind of get something. Maybe this is an interface, whatever. But we know an article is going to have some kind of ID. That's going to be some kind of a UID, a number, right? We'll have something there. What else is a part of the article? Well, there's a whole bunch of article props that we don't need to describe because those were already coded, right? We're kind of coming into this and we just sort of know that there's some existing props. The question is, what do we need to add to an article to complete this feature? We don't need to kind of go over everything that makes up an article. realistically, there's nothing really to add to the article itself, but in our API response, we may want to nest in here bookmarks. So we may want to do one of two things. We'll probably want to do a bookmarks, and this would probably be optional, right? Well, this is probably not something that we are always going to necessarily want, but it will be an array of bookmarks, and we have yet to create that type. I would also venture to say, let's just put in here bookmark count. And this is probably something that we do not always need. However, being the astute person that I am, sometimes we like to possibly put a count in this screen, right? So I could see that showing up later. We could ask that question, but let's just throw a question mark in there. This just in TypeScript land, this just means these may or may not be defined. So we're not always going to return bookmarks and bookmark count, but these are going to kind of be props that we add on the front end. And again, we're just sketching here. We're just kind of coming up with the general idea. So for this, when we get our article, we're going to look to do something like this. We're going to have all our article props, and this is going to come off of here. That's great. Now, we are going to have this concept of a bookmark. So that's all of the possible bookmarks. Let's see here. Let's start with that. And this should be a capital. Again, if you like, and then this is actually now a net new object, never been created before. So we should type it out. This is going to be a UID. Again, we'll go with kind of the TypeScript convention. We are going to have an article ID that's going to reference the article. Some people like, you could just put article, and this is also going to be just the number. And again, we're not storing the whole article here because we don't want to go back into that world where we have duplicated data, right? Denormalization is okay when things are fairly immutable, but if we do feel like we're going to be updating a lot, this could get real hairy real fast. So we don't want to get there. And then the user that it belongs to. That's really quite simple. That's all you need for this. This will also probably have a created at, that type of thing, created at, updated at, some additional attributes to your database. But the meat and potatoes of this is these all must have these items. Now, looking at our article, and we know that we can fetch all the bookmarks to an article, we're not necessarily going to need it to power this page. We really just need the count. Nor do we necessarily... So we don't always want to expose all this data, right? If we're passing like user IDs back with the article in our client responses, there may be no security concern there, but there may be some where we probably just don't want to showcase who's bookmarked this unless it's like an explicit feature of the app. So we'll leave that. But again, the ability to pull the bookmarks through is still there. And on the user, this is the same exact style as this. So let's just duplicate this. User, ID, user props, right? There's a bunch of existing user props. They're going to have bookmarks, and they're going to have a bookmark count. We may or may not want to add bookmark count. This does kind of make some sense as bookmarks get huge. The key piece to this is we're not going to increment a counter here. We're going to want to virtualize this. So for instance, on a page where I need to see here like the person's total bookmarks, that would make a lot of sense, right? If I'm like 30 out of 165. So let's just start to let's imagine some things here, like viewing 30 out of you know, 200 bookmarks or something like that. And then there's like a load more button down here, right? If I wanted to do something like this, it's probably a good idea to be able to kind of fetch those bookmarks. Now, the interesting thing here is, do we really need this? Realistically, to do this, you know, again, we're just kind of thinking out loud here. We really only need this, and then we're going to fetch the article itself, right? There's the article ID and then the user, and then we're going to fetch a bunch of articles based on these IDs. Do we really need the bookmarks coming down with the user? Not really, unless there was a counter up here, which there's not. So I'm going to go ahead and scrap that idea. We're going to say the user stays the same. We fetch bookmarks. This is looking pretty good here. So we're going to need some endpoints here. And let's just, you know, we're going to kind of restfully design these. You know, if this was GraphQL, you would kind of have a different pathway to get to this. But for all intents and purposes, we have a RESTful API for this. So we will go ahead, or JSON API is probably not purely RESTful. We're going to go ahead and we're going to have probably a slash bookmarks. What's probably going to be here is slash user slash ID, right? We'll have the user ID of some kind, or it'll take the token in our case, slash bookmarks. And that'll return all these bookmarks. That kind of makes sense there, right? Oh yeah, I think so. That's going to return all the bookmarks. And then I do think that even though this is the type of our bookmark in the database, we're going to want to return a different type. By the time, you know, I think this is like what comes out. So if we kind of picture, let's just picture our database here, right? Let's just picture this for a second. Our DB has a set of storage kind of. The thing coming out of the database is going to look like this, right? We're going to fetch all these bookmarks, but we're also going to have our application layer, our backend, our API layer, right? It's probably pretty efficient at this stage to have the API and let's just take an article to output this. Not an output article, sorry. We're going to, made a mistake there, sorry. Let's duplicate that. It's going to output, right? We're going to get back an array of bookmarks and then call that bookmarks, articles, and article array for the user. Do we want to return the user? Probably not, but we don't need an ID here. So we're going to end up returning kind of the array of articles. So we're going to say like, hey, get me all the bookmarks, merge that with the articles, right? And that's how we're going to end up with our response. So what we're not looking to do here is to make that happen all on the client. So if we have like the client side here, the logic of bringing all these things together, we want to keep that responsibility on the server. I would consider that type of thing business logic. So when we have our endpoint user ID bookmarks, this, let's delete that, is going to return an array of articles. So we could go ahead and think about it like that. And possibly the user ID, right? User ID bookmarks. Realistically though, our API uses the token pass to identify the user. So user/bookmarks returns an object with a key of articles with all the articles. The API is taking the bookmark and the article, and it's taking all the bookmarks and bringing them together. So, you know, if you look at this, you picture it, it's an array of bookmarks that is coming into the API out of this. And that's how we're going to do that. Pretty straightforward here. That gets us to a pretty good spot here in terms of how we're going to design this. But if we look, the real goal here is to figure out with changing requirements, how do we isolate the as much business logic as we can into the API? That's really where I kind of like to be, and leaving these clients with a lot less logic. And the reason for this is right now we have a single web client, but in the future this may run in more places. Maybe you have some widgets that run on other websites. Maybe you have a native application or something of that sort. When we start to do the logic that pieces all these things together, this makes more sense. So I would like to write out kind of what's going on here. If we're going to kind of outline what's going to happen under user bookmarks. So let's just write ourselves one of our little cards here. Endpoint /user/bookmarks. Right? And then we could kind of say here, will fetch bookmarks by user ID, obtains user ID from the token passed as a cookie. Right? So we're going to use the user token to look up the user, and we're going to fetch all their bookmarks. Makes sense? Receives an array of bookmarks from the database and joins this with the articles using the article ID returned in the bookmark. Now, we could, return kind of a count here too, right? Like, so, you could have like a more efficient endpoint, because like user/bookmarks/total per se. Let's say we wanted to just get the total. Really, then we only need to fetch the array of bookmarks and not continue with the join of the articles, so that you end up with that. And then we could say API response will look like this. And then this is where we can get into, it's going to be data, right? And we'll maybe have an object like this. It'll come back and it'll say articles, and it's an array, and give it like a little sample in here. Cool. Now we have this, and it's just going to have ID, 1, 2, 3, 4, ... article. And we don't need to, we could just go ahead and say ... article. Props. This makes some sense. And then there's usually some kind of like page or pointer or something like that. 0, total pages, I don't know, 20. Again, every database does this kind of bit different, but you'll want to know, there's 20 pages, count per page, 25 or something like that. So then you can always get back to the total number of articles, but your response now, you need to be able to paginate. So you'll be able to kind of design the interface around this, right? So you may want to do page, right? this kind of makes sense. /bookmark/0, the default we can make work also, but we want to get the page number, and let's just say page number will be the page to fetch when paginating. The page count will be hard-coded to 25. User cannot adjust. Right? Keep the requirements simple. It might be tempting to say, oh, I'll make it so that they can adjust the page number or whatever. That's not a given functionality. I would not go ahead and do that. But now we kind of have, again, a rough outline for the first endpoint we're going to create, which is getting the bookmarks by page. So as you can see, we start with this kind of messy, hazy look, and then we boil it down into kind of exactly what we're looking to do here. We're going to fetch the bookmarks. Again, still pretty rough, but now we can take this piece and bring it over to our spec here and attach, right? What does an endpoint look like? And then we can go through. So I will go ahead and kind of outline the rest of the endpoints that are needed for this. And then we're going to dig into kind of how we would model out our client layer.